Authority is a mantle both coveted and feared, a delicate balance between control and compassion. It grants the bearer influence over others, but it also binds them with invisible chains of moral duty. When that duty falters, when the power entrusted for protection becomes a weapon of humiliation, the weight of authority transforms from privilege to burden. The officer in this tale stands as the embodiment of that paradox, a figure vested with societal trust, whose single act of contemptuous defiance fractures the illusion of integrity that once defined him. In his gesture of disdain he expels, not merely saliva, but the last remnant of restraint, casting his humanity into the dust of arrogance. Authority, in its truest form, is not dominance but stewardship. Yet history and human behavior reveal how fragile that principle can be. The psyche of power often feeds upon the illusion of superiority. It convinces the wielder that judgment resides solely within their command. In that moment of expectoration, the officer becomes more than an individual. He becomes a manifestation of corrupted order, the institutional echo of unchecked ego. The contempt he expresses does not simply degrade another, it stains the very foundation upon which his authority rests. What once symbolized justice now becomes an instrument of cruelty. Accountability emerges as the shadow of this authority, an inevitable reckoning that follows misuse. It is the mirror that refuses to distort, forcing the offender to see their reflection, stripped of badges, ranks, or rationalizations. For every transgression hidden beneath the uniform, accountability lingers like a silent witness, patient yet unyielding. When the officer later confronts the revelation of the subject's true identity, the facade of superiority collapses. The contempt he once wielded with casual confidence rebounds upon him, magnified by the enormity of his error. His authority, once an armor, becomes a shroud of shame. In this collapse lies the essence of moral symmetry, the universe's quiet insistence that power without empathy inevitably consumes itself. Authority devoid of conscience breeds chaos within, and accountability, though delayed, arrives as both punishment and purification. The officer's internal landscape begins to shift. The echo of his action reverberates through his conscience like a bell tolling for his own fallibility. What began as an assertion of control transforms into a crisis of identity. He must confront not just what he has done, but what his behavior reveals about the system that shaped him. Authority, therefore, becomes a test of humanity. Its true strength lies not in command, but in the capacity to listen, to recognize the dignity of those it governs. When this recognition falters, the structure collapses from within. The officer's descent into remorse is not merely personal, it symbolizes a broader institutional failure. His authority was meant to uphold order, yet it unravels before the raw truth of accountability, exposing the spiritual cost of moral blindness. The once clear boundary between enforcer and transgressor dissolves, leaving only the universal question: who guards the guardians when their own hearts have turned against them? The haunting reality of accountability is that it cannot be delegated. No tribunal or procedural apology can absolve the soul's internal reckoning. For the officer, the act of contempt becomes an unending loop of self-confrontation. The more he recalls the expression of his victim, the more the illusion of power fades. In the light of accountability, the symbols of rank become hollow ornaments. He is stripped to his essence, a human being forced to acknowledge the fragility of his moral framework. Authority, once a towering monument, now feels like a crumbling edifice, each stone inscribed with the names of those diminished beneath its weight. And yet, within this decay lies the seed of rebirth. Accountability, though punishing, carries the potential for transformation. It does not destroy merely to condemn, it dismantles illusions so that truth may rebuild. For the officer, the path forward demands humility, a surrender to the realization that true authority is inseparable from responsibility. His tears, perhaps unseen, fall upon the same ground that once received his contempt, and in that reversal lies the first quiet step toward redemption. Revelation, when it arrives, is seldom gentle. It shatters illusions with surgical precision, exposing truths that lingered unseen beneath the surface of perception. For the officer, revelation takes the form of a terrible awakening, the discovery of the subject's true identity, a moment that pierces his arrogance like light breaking through the fog of ignorance. In that instant, The story transcends mere confrontation. It becomes an existential unveiling. The external act of contempt, spitting upon another human being, now rebounds inward, transforming the officer's self-image in ways he could never have foreseen. Transformation begins not in the visible world but in the unseen corridors of the mind. The revelation strips him of the narratives he once used to justify his authority. The victim, once viewed through the lens of disdain, now stands as a mirror reflecting his moral bankruptcy. What he sees terrifies him, for it demands the death of the self he once believed unassailable. Revelation, in this sense, is both executioner and midwife. It kills the old and gives birth to the new. The officer's transformation is not one of external circumstance, but of internal reckoning. The boundaries of his identity collapse under the weight of understanding. Revelation functions as the great equalizer. It disregards uniforms, titles, and hierarchy, speaking directly to the conscience. The officer's act of contempt was born of blindness. Revelation, therefore, becomes his vision restored. In recognizing the subject's true identity, perhaps one of innocence, perhaps one of sacred significance, he confronts the unbearable truth that he has desecrated something pure. The shame that floods him is not merely emotional, it is alchemical. It begins to transmute his pride into humility, his ignorance into insight. Transformation through revelation thus becomes the crucible in which the soul is refined by the fire of truth. Every revelation carries with it a demand. It calls for the restructuring of belief, the dismantling of comfort. The officer's revelation compels him to question not just his action, but the entire framework of perception that enabled it. The contemptuous act now stands as a symbol of everything he must unlearn. Each recollection of that moment burns deeper, carving channels through which empathy might finally flow. Transformation, then, is not instantaneous. It is a prolonged burning away of falsity. The officer must navigate the ruins of his former self, uncertain whether he will emerge whole or hollow. In the world of this story, transformation is inseparable from suffering. Revelation does not soothe, it sears. But within that searing lies its sacred purpose, to cleanse the mind of delusion and reorient it toward truth. The officer, who once viewed authority as a shield, now sees it as a mirror reflecting his failures. The transformation is both moral and metaphysical, a shift from blindness to sight, from hardness to vulnerability. Each fragment of his shattered pride becomes a shard of illumination. As the revelation deepens, the external world seems to echo the officer's inner change. The light appears harsher, the air heavier, as though the environment itself bears witness to his awakening. He perceives the fragility of life with newfound clarity, the trembling line between cruelty and compassion. Transformation through revelation becomes an existential pilgrimage, one where forgiveness, if it ever comes, must begin within. The act of contempt once sought to diminish another, now it diminishes the self who performed it. The old authority dissolves, replaced by a quiet recognition of shared humanity. In that recognition, a truth emerges. Revelation is not merely the unveiling of another's identity, but the rediscovery of one's own. Contempt is a seed that takes root in the smallest cracks of human pride, watered by self-righteousness and the illusion of moral superiority. It begins quietly, a subtle curl of the lip, a flicker of disdain in the eyes. But left unchecked, it grows into an act so corrosive it stains both the giver and the receiver. For the officer, contempt manifests not as words, but as an act of physical dismissal, an expectoration that carries with it the full weight of degradation. In that single moment he believes he is asserting dominance, re-establishing a hierarchy in which his uniform grants him the right to demean. Yet the true consequence of contempt is that it never flows in one direction. What he casts outward inevitably circles back, a venomous echo that finds its way to the soul of the one who released it. The consequences of contempt often unfold in layers, some immediate, others insidious and slow burning. In the first instant there is silence, the kind that follows after an unthinkable act, when even the air recoils. The victim's face becomes a mirror the officer cannot bear to meet, for in that reflection lies everything he has chosen to forget, his humanity, his fragility, his vulnerability. Contempt, by its nature, seeks to erase the other person's dignity. It operates under the delusion that to diminish another is to elevate oneself. But the moment the deed is done, a strange reversal begins. The one who spits becomes the one who is spiritually soiled. The uniform that once conferred authority now feels heavy with moral grime. Contempt corrodes the vessel that contains it. Its aftermath lingers not just in the conscience but in the body. The tightening of the chest, the tremor of the hands, the inexplicable restlessness that no authority can quiet. The officer feels it as an unease that creeps beneath his skin. His mind replays the scene, searching for justification, but finds none that can silence the faint whisper of guilt rising from the depths. Contempt was supposed to be a demonstration of power, yet it has left him powerless against his own reflection. The consequences have transformed from social to psychological. They gnaw at the edges of sleep. They hum beneath every breath. In the wider context, contempt carries societal repercussions. It ripples beyond the individuals involved, infecting the institution it represents. Each act of disdain, though seemingly personal, undermines collective trust. The officer's contempt does not merely degrade one subject, it diminishes the legitimacy of the system itself. When contempt becomes normalized among those in power, it signals decay from within. Authority ceases to serve and begins to consume. The officer, though unaware at first, becomes both symptom and warning. His personal collapse mirrors the moral erosion of the very order he was meant to uphold. The psychological consequence of contempt is isolation. It severs the invisible thread of empathy that connects human beings. Once the officer has allowed himself to treat another as unworthy of respect, he erects a wall around his own heart. The wall seems protective, but in truth, it is a prison. Inside it, compassion suffocates. His interactions become mechanical, his authority hollow. The act of contempt creates distance not only from his victim but from his own sense of belonging to the shared human condition. He becomes estranged from the world he polices, a ghost in uniform. And yet, contempt carries within it the possibility of revelation precisely because of its devastating consequences. It is an act that exposes the soul's fractures. When the officer later faces the reality of the subject's true identity, the magnitude of his contempt collapses upon him like an avalanche. Every justification he once believed crumbles. What seemed like a minor assertion of control becomes an indelible mark upon his conscience. The consequence now transcends the personal, it becomes existential. He must confront not only what he has done but what he has become. The act of contempt transforms from a momentary expression into a permanent scar, a moral tattoo that cannot be erased by apology or rank. There is also a metaphysical dimension to contempt's consequence, the distortion of perception. The officer's worldview begins to warp under the pressure of guilt. He sees reminders of his act everywhere, in the stillness of his reflection, in the disapproval of unseen eyes, in the silence that follows his every command. Contempt, once externalized, internalizes itself as haunting. It rewrites memory, infects self-perception, and converts arrogance into fear. The officer cannot undo what he has done, but he cannot escape it either. Each breath becomes an inhalation of remorse, each exhalation a futile attempt to expel it. Contempt thus becomes a paradox. It is an attempt to assert superiority that ends in humiliation. It is an effort to control that leads to loss of control. In the end, the consequences of contempt are not confined to the moral sphere. They become physical, psychological, and spiritual. The officer's contempt does not merely provoke reaction in the world around him, it transforms his very being, reducing the structure of authority to a fragile shell. Beneath the uniform, the man is revealed, small, trembling, haunted by the weight of his own disdain. Human fragility and redemption. Human fragility is not a weakness, but the essence of what makes existence both perilous and profound. It is the recognition that beneath every mask of strength lies the trembling uncertainty of one who fears to fall. The officer's story is a study in this duality, an exploration of how easily pride can fracture when confronted with truth, and how, through that fracture, the first glimmer of redemption may emerge. His contemptuous act was born from denial of fragility, from the desperate belief that power exempts him from vulnerability. Yet the discovery of the subject's true identity shatters this illusion, exposing the soft underbelly of his humanity. Fragility reveals itself in the moment when certainty dissolves. The officer, who once stood unshaken in his conviction, now trembles at the memory of his own gesture. The act of expectoration, so simple, so impulsive, returns to him as an echo of his weakness. It becomes a symbol of the fragility he tried to suppress, a manifestation of his inability to control the chaos within himself. Every human being carries such chaos, but authority teaches its bearers to hide it behind the armor of discipline. The officer's outburst exposes the truth that authority is often a fragile facade, one crack away from collapse. Redemption begins when fragility is no longer denied. It arises not from punishment but from recognition. The officer's journey toward redemption is not linear, it is a slow, painful unfolding. The first step is awareness, the dawning realization that his act cannot be undone, but its meaning can be transformed. He must face the full weight of his fragility, not as a curse, but as the only ground upon which genuine humanity can stand. In the silence of remorse, he begins to perceive the faint outline of forgiveness, not as something owed to him, but as something he must earn through change. Fragility paradoxically becomes strength when acknowledged. It allows empathy to flow where arrogance once reigned. The officer's understanding deepens as he confronts his own brokenness. In that confrontation, the seeds of redemption take root. The very emotion that once led to contempt, fear of weakness, now begins to understand the pain of those he once dismissed. In their eyes, he now sees reflections of his own vulnerability. This shift marks the beginning of moral resurrection, not the erasure of guilt, but the transformation of guilt into understanding. Redemption, however, demands endurance. It is not a single act of remorse, but a continual choice to live with awareness of one's fragility. The officer must navigate the shame that accompanies this awareness, the loss of self-imprisonment, the collapse of identity, the lingering doubt that forgiveness is even possible. Each day becomes a quiet struggle between despair and hope. In this struggle, redemption gains depth. It is no longer about restoring his former dignity, but about discovering a new kind of integrity, one built not on authority, but on humility. The fragility of the human heart is what makes it capable of redemption. The same sensitivity that allows it to break also allows it to heal. The officer's tears, though unseen, represent more than sorrow. They signify the beginning of reconciliation between his inner and outer selves. Where once he sought to command respect through fear, he now begins to seek it through understanding. The power he once wielded as a weapon becomes a responsibility he must bear with care. Fragility and redemption thus become entwined, two halves of a cycle that sustains moral growth. End of point 004. The deeper truth revealed through his journey is that redemption cannot exist without fragility. A perfect being has no need for forgiveness, and therefore no capacity for grace. It is the imperfection, the stumbling, the falling, that makes redemption meaningful. The officer's story becomes a testament to this paradox. His fragility, once hidden beneath the rigidity of command, now becomes his teacher. Through it he learns that strength is not the absence of weakness, but the courage to face it. His redemption does not erase his past, it illuminates it, turning shame into a reminder of what must never be repeated. In the quiet aftermath of revelation, fragility remains as both wound and wisdom. It humbles the officer, grounding him in the reality that authority without compassion is hollow. His redemption, though incomplete, takes form in the gentleness of his future choices, in the care he gives to those once beneath his notice. The man who once believed himself untouchable now understands that every human being stands at the mercy of their own conscience, and that fragility is not the enemy of strength, but its truest source. The conscience is a mirror that never lies. It may remain silent for a time, fogged by self-deception or dulled by habit, but it always waits for the moment when truth demands reflection. The officer's contemptuous act becomes the catalyst that clears the mist from that mirror, forcing him to see himself with unbearable clarity. In the immediate aftermath, he feels the heat of anger, the satisfaction of power exercised without resistance. But when the echo of his expectoration fades, a different sound arises, the faint inner whisper that begins to ask questions no authority can silence. In that whisper lies the awakening of conscience, the voice of the mirror calling him to look. Conscience does not speak in words, but in sensations. The tightening of the chest, the hollowness in the stomach, the sudden inability to meet one's own gaze. The officer experiences all of these. He tries to bury them beneath the justifications of his role, discipline, order, command. Yet the mirror remains before him, polished by guilt, reflecting not the uniform but the man beneath it. What he sees there unsettles him. The face he once knew so well, the face of control, composure, and conviction, now appears distorted, marked by something he cannot name. It is as though the act of contempt has left an invisible stain that no amount of authority can wash away. The mirror of conscience demands honesty, but honesty is the last refuge of those who wish to remain untroubled by truth. The officer begins to sense the divide between who he believes himself to be and who he has shown himself to be. The split grows with each recollection of his act. He replays it in his mind. The sharp movement, the look of the subject, the silence that followed, and each repetition deepens the fissure. The mirror does not accuse outright. It reveals. What he sees within it is not a monster, but a man capable of monstrosity, and that realization frightens him more than any external punishment ever could. The mirror's reflection is both judgment and invitation. It condemns the act while offering the possibility of transformation. But the officer resists. He looks away, tries to lose himself in procedure, in the machinery of authority, in the predictable rhythm of control. Yet the mirror is patient. It waits in the pauses before his duties, in the moments before sleep, in the spaces where silence allows thought to rise. There the image of his victim appears, not accusingly, but unforgettably. The reflection expands beyond his own face. It becomes a panorama of his choices, his habits, his complacency. The mirror of conscience is never still. It shifts and evolves with the depth of one's understanding. The more he looks, the more he sees that contempt was not an isolated act, but a culmination. It was born of years of small justifications, of unchecked assumptions, of the quiet erosion of empathy. The mirror forces him to confront that pattern. It shows him the moments he ignored, the people he dismissed, the compassion he withheld. Each reflection adds another weight to his spirit, pressing him toward recognition. He cannot claim ignorance any longer. The mirror will not allow it. The confrontation with conscience becomes a form of purification. The officer's denial begins to crack, and through those cracks light enters. The mirror reveals not only his flaws but his potential for remorse. In its reflection he begins to perceive the first flickers of humanity returning, the empathy he thought long buried beneath discipline and pride. Yet even this recognition comes with pain, for conscience rarely offers comfort. Its mercy is fierce, its lessons costly. To truly look is to bleed inwardly, to feel the sting of awareness cutting through layers of self-deception. The mirror of conscience does not exist in isolation. It connects the individual to the moral fabric of the world. When the officer sees his reflection, he is also seeing the reflection of the system that shaped him. His contempt was not born in a vacuum. It was sanctioned, subtly encouraged by a culture that confuses obedience with virtue. The mirror shows him this wider context, and the weight of it nearly crushes him. He realizes that his personal guilt is entwined with institutional failure. The mirror does not differentiate between the two, it simply reveals the totality of what is. As he continues to look, the mirror's image begins to change. The reflection no longer mocks him, it mourns him. It shows him the man he could have been, the dignity he could have upheld, the compassion he could have shown. This recognition, while agonizing, marks the beginning of awakening. The mirror of conscience, after all, is not meant to destroy, it exists to restore balance. Through it, he learns that to see oneself clearly is both a punishment and a gift. The officer begins to understand that true authority cannot exist without this mirror, that conscience is not an enemy of order, but its only legitimate foundation. The reflection, however, will never vanish. It will accompany him in every future command, every word, every silence. The mirror has etched itself into his consciousness, a constant reminder of the cost of contempt. Though he may carry on outwardly unchanged, inwardly he will forever be the man who looked into that mirror and saw the truth of his own humanity staring back. The symbolism of purity and exposure. Purity is often misunderstood as innocence untouched by experience, but in its truest form, purity arises from exposure, from the revelation of truth stripped bare of pretension. In the story's strange transformation, the emergence of albinism becomes the physical embodiment of this paradox. It is not a biological curiosity, but a symbolic illumination, a visible manifestation of the soul laid open to truth. The act of contempt, dark and defiling, becomes the unintentional key that unlocks this revelation. What once hid beneath shadow now stands revealed in blinding clarity. Exposure is the condition through which purity asserts itself. When the officer witnesses the transformation, he is not merely seeing a change in pigment, but a transfiguration of meaning. The whiteness that emerges is not of skin, but of revelation. It exposes everything concealed beneath the surface. The subject, once diminished by contempt, becomes the mirror through which purity confronts corruption. The light of this transformation pierces the officer's constructed world, making every pretense of control appear trivial, and every act of cruelty obscene. He stands before the spectacle of his own undoing, exposed not to others, but to himself. The symbolism of purity here is not moral perfection, but moral illumination. It reveals the contrast between darkness and light, ignorance and awareness. The officer's world was one of shadowed certainty, a place where authority defined truth. The sudden exposure to purity annihilates that comfort. It strips him bare of illusion, leaving only the raw awareness of consequence. The whiteness, the symbolic albinism, is not a punishment, but a revelation of essence. It externalizes the invisible, translating moral truth into visible form. The purity of this transformation does not cleanse him, it exposes him. Exposure is both terrifying and necessary. It is the breaking open of concealment, the unveiling of what the heart prefers to hide. For the officer, exposure means facing the full extent of his moral nakedness. The uniform that once insulated him now feels like a costume, unable to protect him from the clarity that surrounds him. The subject's transformation becomes a living sermon, that purity cannot be destroyed by contempt, that light, when revealed, does not need defense. In that illumination, the officer's superiority dissolves, and what remains is awe, mingled with despair. The albinism becomes a metaphor for truth stripped of all disguise. It signifies transparency, of conscience, of intention, of consequence. The colorless skin reflects every shade of the officer's inner corruption, every hidden cruelty, every unacknowledged fear. In its presence he feels simultaneously condemned and liberated, for purity does not accuse, it simply is. Its very being exposes the falsity of everything that stands opposed to it. The officer realizes, perhaps too late, that what he mistook for strength was merely concealment, and that to be seen truly is the greatest test of all. Exposure also carries with it a redemptive potential. Though it humiliates, it also illuminates a path toward self-understanding. In witnessing purity untainted by his contempt, the officer confronts the possibility of renewal. The revelation does not destroy him, it unmasks him. He begins to grasp that purity is not a state to be possessed, but a truth to be approached through humility. The subject's transformation becomes a lesson written not in words but in radiance, a silent indictment and a silent invitation alike. The symbolism deepens when one considers the paradox of visibility. What was once hidden now becomes unhideable. The transformation forces the world to look, to bear witness, to confront the discomfort of its own participation in the conditions that made such contempt possible. Purity, once invisible, now stands in full view, making denial impossible. Exposure thus becomes both a revelation and a revolution, a turning of perception that compels recognition. The officer, in seeing, becomes seen. His inner corruption, once private, now feels illuminated as though under divine scrutiny. The interplay between purity and exposure also reveals the deeper law of moral existence, that truth, no matter how long suppressed, seeks expression. The emergence of albinism is the physical metaphor for this inevitability. It is the body declaring what the spirit has endured. Purity does not arrive as reward, but as consequence, the natural unveiling that follows the shedding of deceit. For the officer, this means that he cannot hide behind authority any longer. Exposure has made him transparent to himself. The purity he once dismissed as weakness now becomes the force that judges him without words. As he stands before the revealed subject, he senses that purity is not gentle. It burns not with cruelty but with the intensity of unfiltered truth. It strips away justification, leaving only the stark contrast between what is and what should have been. The exposure of purity is not meant to shame but to awaken. Yet awakening, for one who has lived in shadow, feels like torment. The light is too bright, the air too clear. Every defense the officer once relied on crumbles beneath the weight of this radiance. The transformation teaches that purity is not the absence of corruption, but its transcendence. It is the state achieved when truth has been fully exposed and endured. The subject's whiteness becomes the embodiment of survival, the triumph of essence over degradation. In witnessing this, the officer experiences a collapse of certainty. His categories of power and submission, guilt and innocence, dissolve. He understands that purity is not about moral superiority, but about the courage to be unveiled, to exist without masks. Exposure becomes the crucible through which all illusions are burned away, leaving only the truth that was there all along. Through this symbolism, the story suggests that purity is not found in concealment or denial, but in revelation, in the willingness to be seen in full, both in one's error and one's awakening. The officer, exposed before the purity he once sought to defile, finds himself illuminated not by condemnation, but by the inescapable truth that light once revealed cannot be unseen. Authority often masks its fragility beneath the appearance of control, but beneath the uniform, beneath the tone of command, lies a human mind susceptible to doubt, fear, and guilt. When that authority is fractured by moral failure, the unraveling begins quietly. The officer feels it first as a restlessness, a subtle trembling within the structure of his confidence. The contemptuous act he committed was meant to reaffirm his dominance, to silence his own insecurities, yet it becomes the very force that exposes them. His thoughts, once orderly and disciplined, begin to splinter. The memory of the act intrudes at odd moments, unbidden and vivid, until it becomes impossible to contain. The authority that once protected him now becomes a source of torment, a mask too heavy to wear. He begins to question his every gesture, his every command, suspecting weakness in what once felt like strength. The unraveling is psychological, but it seeps into the physical. His heartbeat quickens without cause. His voice falters. His composure cracks. Authority, once external, collapses inward, revealing the chaos it was meant to conceal. He senses eyes upon him even when alone. The gaze of conscience or of unseen judgment. In the echo of his own orders he hears accusation. Every corridor, every silence seems to murmur the truth he cannot escape. The power that once defined him now feels hollow, and the title he bears clings to him like an ill-fitting garment. The unraveling deepens as self-perception turns against him, and the line between control and collapse grows indistinguishable. Identity and illumination. Identity is not a fixed possession, but a construct shaped by perception, belief, and revelation. For the officer, the discovery of the subject's true identity becomes an illumination so blinding it obliterates his understanding of self. The revelation forces him to confront the falseness of the labels by which he defined worth and hierarchy. The light of truth falls upon both the subject and the oppressor, exposing that identity built on superiority is an illusion sustained by ignorance. He feels stripped of the authority that once gave him meaning, standing bare before the radiance of realization. Illumination burns away the comfort of certainty. It reveals that what he mistook for order was merely the darkness of unawareness. In that light, he perceives the fragile architecture of his identity collapsing, leaving behind only the trembling awareness of shared humanity. The subject he dehumanized now becomes his teacher, the mirror of his awakening. Illumination does not grant peace, it wounds, for it forces the heart to see what the eyes once refused. The officer's identity dissolves into reflection, and from that dissolution emerges understanding. Society often sees through the lens of assumption, shaping justice not by truth, but by perception. The officer's act reflects this blindness, a system so accustomed to hierarchy that cruelty hides behind protocol. Moral blindness spreads quietly, disguised as order, until empathy becomes weakness and judgment becomes routine. When truth emerges, the collective gaze shifts, but too late. The harm has already taken root. The officer becomes both culprit and symptom, revealing how institutions mirror the blindness of their creators, how justice decays when sight is replaced by convenience. Transformation is both physical and metaphysical, the body echoing the turmoil of the soul. The emergence of albinism symbolizes exposure, a biological reflection of moral awakening. Science may describe it as mutation, but the story renders it meaning. Skin becoming the canvas of conscience. The transformation bridges matter and spirit, revealing that every action leaves an imprint, that the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Shame enters like a shadow that cannot be banished, clinging to the soul in the aftermath of revelation. For the officer, shame becomes the first honest emotion he has felt since his act of contempt. It is not the kind of shame born from public exposure, but the deeper, more corrosive kind. The shame that blooms in solitude, when the world is quiet and one is left alone with the memory of what one has done. It arrives in layers, subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from discomfort, until it gathers mass and becomes a presence that alters the rhythm of breath. Each time he closes his eyes, he sees the act repeated, the motion, the sound, the face of the other. Shame does not let him look away. It insists on confrontation. At first he resists it. He tries to rationalize, to retreat into the safety of procedure, into the hierarchy that once shielded him from moral consequence. But shame seeps through those defenses like light through cracks. It demands that he look inward, that he recognize the true weight of his contempt. This recognition is agony. It is the disintegration of identity, the shattering of the self-impetition he once held sacred. The officer who once saw himself as protector now sees himself as violator. The shame burns not only for the act but for the blindness that made the act possible. Shame, however, is not merely punishment. It is also a teacher. It exposes the gap between who one pretends to be and who one truly is. For the first time, the officer feels the depth of that gap, and in that feeling, the possibility of change begins to stir. Shame's cruelty lies in its honesty. It strips away every layer of justification, every shield of pride, until all that remains is the raw, trembling truth. To face that truth without fleeing is to begin the process of enlightenment. The light does not come softly. It arrives like fire. It burns through denial, through fear, through the illusion of control. Yet in that burning, something essential is revealed. The recognition that moral awakening begins where ego ends. The enlightenment that shame brings is not grand or transcendent. It begins in small moments, the hesitation before speaking, the pause before judgment, the sudden surge of empathy when seeing another in pain. The officer starts to notice what he once ignored. His senses sharpen, his awareness deepens. Every sound, every expression feels heavy with meaning. He begins to see the world not through the lens of authority, but through the eyes of humility. Shame has humbled him, not by breaking him down, but by forcing him to acknowledge the limits of his understanding. Yet enlightenment through shame is not a clean path. It is messy, cyclical, filled with relapses into guilt and self-reproach. The officer swings between remorse and paralysis. Sometimes the weight of his awareness feels unbearable. He longs to return to ignorance, to the numbness of command. But shame will not allow retreat. It keeps him suspended in a liminal state, where every choice must be made with consciousness. This state becomes a kind of purification. Each wave of shame washes away another layer of self-deception, leaving him exposed, yet clearer, fragile, yet honest. In this process, shame transforms from tormentor to guide. It leads him toward empathy, the very quality he once suppressed. He begins to sense that the enlightenment he seeks cannot come from atonement alone, but from transformation. To be enlightened is not to escape shame, but to learn from it, to understand that it is the shadow cast by conscience, and that the brighter the light of awareness, the darker the shadow becomes. Shame, in its paradox, becomes the evidence of awakening. It is the proof that he has begun to feel again, to perceive again, to see himself not as a figure of power, but as a flawed, learning being. As shame deepens, the officer's relationship with authority changes. What once felt like certainty now feels like a question. Every command he gives trembles with doubt, every gesture carries the memory of what power can corrupt. This doubt, once feared, becomes sacred. It protects him from returning to blindness. The shame that once burned now glows softly within him, a constant reminder of the human cost of arrogance. He realizes that enlightenment is not a single moment of clarity but an ongoing act of remembering, to remember what harm feels like, to remember what it means to see another as fully human. In the silence of his reflection, he comes to understand that shame is not an end but a passage. It is the soul's way of mourning its own ignorance. Through that mourning, compassion is born. The officer, once driven by duty, now moves with awareness. Each act, each word, is weighed against the image in his mind. The image of what he once did and who he must never be again. In that self-awareness lies the fragile spark of enlightenment, lit by the flame of shame that first brought him to his knees. Empathy reborn through suffering. Suffering is the crucible in which empathy is reforged. The officer's journey from contempt to understanding begins not with intellectual realization, but with pain, deep, personal, and transformative. When he witnesses the consequences of his act, something within him fractures. The same suffering he once inflicted begins to echo inside him. It manifests as sleepless nights, as a heaviness that lingers no matter how he tries to distract himself. This suffering is not punishment imposed by others. It is the self's own revolt against its disconnection from compassion. In that pain, a strange new awareness begins to grow. Empathy, once dormant, awakens, not through comfort, but through discomfort. It rises from the recognition of shared vulnerability. The officer begins to see that the distance he once believed existed between himself and others was an illusion. The subject of his contempt, now transformed, becomes a symbol of that realization, a mirror reflecting his capacity to wound and to feel. Through suffering, he begins to understand that pain is universal, that no act of degradation occurs in isolation. The harm inflicted on another inevitably wounds the one who inflicts it, threading suffering through both sides of the human equation. This recognition reshapes his perception of the world. Where once he saw subordinates and strangers, he now sees mirrors of his own fragility. Empathy, newly reborn, is raw and unsteady. It stings rather than soothes. He feels too much. The tremor in a voice, the sadness behind silence, the fear in the eyes of those who stand before authority. His suffering has stripped him of detachment, leaving him open to the emotional currents he once dismissed as weakness. It is overwhelming at first, yet this sensitivity becomes the foundation of his healing. To feel pain fully is to reclaim one's humanity. Through suffering, the officer learns that empathy is not pity, it is participation in another's reality. It requires courage to step into the emotional space of another, to acknowledge their experience as one's own. Each memory of his act becomes a lesson in that courage. He begins to see that the only redemption possible is to bear witness, to remain open to the suffering he caused, and to transform it into understanding. Empathy becomes the alchemy that turns his guilt into connection, his shame into care. He finds himself drawn to silence, to listening rather than speaking, to seeing rather than judging. The world begins to appear alive again, charged with significance. Suffering softens what arrogance hardened. It dismantles the structure of superiority that once defined his interactions. Now, when he encounters others, he feels their humanity before their status. Empathy gives texture to his perception. It allows him to sense pain beneath composure, to recognize fear behind defiance. Each moment of awareness becomes an act of restitution. The suffering that once felt meaningless now serves a purpose. It binds him to others not through power but through understanding. Empathy reborn is fragile, easily lost, easily overwhelmed. It demands continual humility. The officer learns that to remain empathetic, he must accept his own wounds without resentment. Suffering taught him that pain is not something to be conquered, but something to be understood. His empathy becomes his compass, guiding him away from the blind certainty that once governed his actions. Where once he saw others as objects within his jurisdiction, he now sees them as bearers of stories, each as intricate and wounded as his own. The rebirth of empathy is not peaceful. It is turbulent, filled with contradictions. He feels both sorrow and gratitude, guilt and grace. Suffering has not made him righteous. It has made him real. The more he embraces empathy, the more he senses the world's pain, but also its capacity for renewal. In the trembling recognition of another's suffering, he finds the faint rhythm of redemption. Empathy becomes the bridge between the man he was and the man he struggles to become, a fragile but enduring connection forged in the fire of remorse. Control is a fragile illusion, a structure built upon the trembling scaffolding of human will. The officer once believed that control defined him, that authority meant mastery over chaos, order imposed upon disorder. Yet control, when examined closely, reveals itself as something more brittle than steel and more temporary than breath. It is not the absence of weakness, but the denial of it. When the officer acted with contempt, he did so under the assumption that his power was unshakable, that the system would sustain him no matter the moral weight of his actions. But control begins to fracture the moment it is abused. It cracks, not from external opposition, but from within, as the conscience rebels against its own suppression. In the days following his act, he feels the tremors of this collapse. The gestures of command, once second nature, begin to feel hollow. His voice, though firm, carries a faint quiver he cannot conceal. His subordinates still obey, yet their obedience no longer reassures him. It only amplifies the silence within. The illusion of control depends on the belief that others cannot see the fracture, but the mind knows, the body knows. Each word he speaks feels like an imitation of authority rather than its embodiment. What once flowed effortlessly now requires force, and the more he exerts it, the less convincing it becomes. Control has turned against him, revealing itself as dependency, an addiction to dominance that has lost its power to numb. The fragility of control lies in its false promise of permanence. It thrives on the delusion that order can suppress truth. But the officer's act of contempt has set a truth in motion that no discipline can contain. It grows quietly in his thoughts, a presence that resists command. He begins to see that every act of control is shadowed by fear. The fear of powerlessness, of exposure, of collapse. Authority, when stripped of compassion, becomes merely the defense against that fear. The tighter he grips it, the more it slips through his hands. The uniform that once made him invincible now feels like armor rusting around a wounded heart. He senses that control is not strength at all, but tension, a constant, unsustainable effort to hold back the chaos within. The more he tries to restore his composure, the more he feels the weight of his own trembling. His perception of reality begins to distort. Small noises startle him, silence unnerves him, and his reflection in the mirror feels like that of a stranger. The architecture of control, once towering and stable, begins to sway. He realizes that he is no longer commanding others but performing the act of command, as though to convince himself that the power still exists. But control, once exposed as illusion, cannot be rebuilt in the same way. Its fragility is permanent, for once the truth of vulnerability has been seen, it cannot be unseen. In the unraveling of control lies a paradoxical liberation. The officer's downfall, painful as it is, reveals to him the falsity of the structure he once worshipped. True control, he begins to understand, is not imposed but accepted. It comes from alignment with truth rather than resistance to it. His previous authority, built on fear, now feels insignificant compared to the quiet discipline of honesty. The fragility of control is not merely personal but universal. It is the human condition made visible. Every person, in seeking to dominate their world, must one day confront the realization that mastery is fleeting, that the greatest power lies in surrendering the need for domination. The officer's crisis becomes the mirror of this truth, his trembling hands the proof that even the strongest command can falter before the weight of conscience. The collapse of control does not destroy him entirely. Instead, it exposes the possibility of something purer, a balance born not of dominance but of humility. The authority he once wielded outwardly now turns inward, demanding mastery not over others but over the self. And in that internal struggle he discovers that fragility is not the enemy of control but its foundation. For only by acknowledging the trembling can one truly understand what steadiness means. Moral awakening in the aftermath of disgrace. Disgrace is often imagined as an end, but in truth it is the beginning of moral awakening. It strips away every illusion of virtue and leaves only the raw core of what a person truly is. For the officer, disgrace arrives not through public condemnation, but through the internal recognition of guilt. The world may still salute him, but within, he knows the truth. The act that once felt fleeting now stands as a monument to his failure, an unmovable truth in the landscape of his conscience. His disgrace is silent but consuming, reshaping his identity from the inside out. Moral awakening begins in that silence. It does not come as revelation or reward, but as endurance, the capacity to face what has been done without retreat. The officer's disgrace becomes his teacher, forcing him to look upon his actions with unflinching eyes. He sees not only his cruelty, but the ignorance that allowed it, the blindness that made it possible. Each layer of realization deepens the wound. Yet within the wound lies understanding. Awakening is born not from the denial of pain, but from the willingness to dwell in it. In the aftermath of disgrace, time slows. The officer moves through his days as though the world has grown heavier, denser, more deliberate. Every interaction feels altered, as if reality itself has shifted to reflect his internal transformation. The people around him speak as they always did, yet their words seem filled with meanings he never noticed before. He begins to listen differently, to hear beneath the surface, to sense emotion where once he saw only duty. His disgrace has opened his perception, peeling back the hardened layers of authority that once insulated him from feeling. Moral awakening is not a redemption story, it is an evolution of sight. The officer learns to see through his own falseness. The shame that once suffocated him becomes light enough to carry, not because it diminishes, but because he learns to bear it consciously. He accepts that the act cannot be undone, but it can be understood. In that understanding lies the seed of moral clarity. Disgrace has humbled him into authenticity. Where once he performed righteousness, he now practices awareness. This awakening extends beyond the personal into the universal. He begins to see how the world is structured around invisible hierarchies of contempt, how easily people become blind to the dignity of others, how casually power mistakes itself for virtue. His disgrace has stripped him of the privilege of unawareness, and though it pains him, he would not trade it back. The light of awakening is harsh but honest. It shows him the fractures in every system, including the one within himself. In the solitude of reflection, the officer begins to sense that moral awakening is not about absolution but about alignment. It demands that his actions and awareness finally meet. No longer can he act without feeling the weight of consequence. His disgrace, which once seemed like ruin, becomes the ground upon which truth can take root. Every pang of guilt, every tremor of remorse, becomes part of the soil in which his new self begins to grow. He understands now that disgrace is not merely punishment, it is a revelation of proportion. It reminds him that all authority is temporary, that all identity is fragile, that every human being stands equally exposed before the law of conscience. His awakening is therefore not a return to innocence, but a movement toward integrity. The man who once believed he stood above others now walks among them, aware of his fallibility, aware of the sacred weight of every gesture. In the quiet hours when he recalls the moment of his downfall, he no longer flinches. The memory has lost its power to humiliate because it has been transmuted into awareness. The aftermath of disgrace has become a sanctuary for reflection, a space where moral understanding breathes. The officer, though scarred, carries within him a light that was born only because he fell, a light that guides him not toward perfection, but toward the ceaseless labor of being human. The screen dims to a deep, cinematic twilight, the final echo of the story still lingering in the air. A subtle swell of orchestral ambience rises beneath a slow zoom toward the channel emblem of A1 Storyteller, glowing like a promise in the dusk. The narrator's voice, steady yet edged with emotion, cuts through the hush. In every act of darkness there waits the faintest glimmer of understanding. If this tale moved you even for a moment, let that spark live on, share it, speak it, and keep it alive. The background transitions to a montage of past story titles, each flickering across the screen like fragments of memory, interwoven with faint whispers of dialogue from previous episodes. As the sound builds, the voice returns, warmer now, inviting connection. Join the circle of voices who seek meaning beneath the surface. Subscribe to A1 Storyteller and step deeper into the stories that dare to confront silence. Soft percussive beats begin to pulse, syncing with the rhythm of glowing icons. Subscribe, like, comment, share. Each word illuminates in sequence, fading into a luminous path that leads toward the channel logo once more. Your voice shapes what comes next. Leave your thoughts below. What truth did you see in this? What light did you find in the shadow? The music swells, and the visual slowly blurs into a horizon of ink and light, where the final line appears in elegant serif type. They are headed after workouts. A1 Storyteller, where every story listens back. A faint chime marks the end as the outro fades to black, leaving a final whispered echo. Subscribe, reflect, return.